We'll start off with Ben Click. Ben is an inflammatory bowel disease gastroenterologist. He trained in internal medicine and GI at the University of Pittsburgh, where he was a T32 fellow and served as the chief fellow. Then he joined the faculty at Cleveland Clinic and is now a triple threat at the University of Colorado, where he's been a mentor to many peers and trainees who he's roped into very successful research endeavors, often centered on postoperative Crohn's disease and IBD care delivery. So thank you, Ben.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I was asked to speak about finding an academic position, not only straight out of fellowship, but also as a potential early career transition. So that's what we'll be trying to tackle over the next 10 minutes or so. I think it's always helpful to understand who is actually speaking in front of you. So I included a little biographical sketch here just to give you a who is this guy type speech. As David alluded to, I graduated from UPMC in 2018. I went to Cleveland Clinic for 4 years, where I was associate staff and then went to a staff position. In 2022, I transitioned to the University of Colorado, where I am today. And as David alluded to, I pride myself as a clinician researcher, spending almost an equal split between clinical and research time. And I have a variety of mechanisms through which I fund and protect that time. And I won't belabor what David alluded to in terms of my areas of focus. Importantly and personally, I'm married to a physician as well, who's a surgical subspecialist in ENT. I have 2 young kids, so a 4-year-old and a 6-month-old, and I have a dog who pleaded to be in the room with me tonight, so you may see him pop up throughout the presentation. And that does influence some of my decisions and recommendations. So when talking about post-training employment, and I realize the crowd may be either in the midst of this or starting to think about this or already in a position, this is how I think about selecting jobs straight out of training. So in no particular order. Geography, that was important to me. So really thinking about, are there particular areas of the country or globe really where you foresee yourself practicing or not practicing, and breaking this up into urban versus rural. Are you a beach or mountains person? And this helps create a list of potential target locations or exclude locations. I think very importantly, family. So happy spouse, happy kids is a very important come home and be happy type mechanism. And you all have probably heard that before, but it also bleeds into what's your support structure in terms of your physical location. A lot of us have to think about financial considerations. So whether that's how much debt you have from medical school and possibly training as well. But does that position or university setting offer such things as loan forgiveness? Will you be making enough money in your position to fund or pay back loans or fund your lifestyle, whatever that may be? And no judgment. People just have specific and personal considerations when it comes to finance. And perhaps kind of what we focus most on when we talk about career advice and finding a job is, what are you trying to do with your career? What do you foresee yourself being as a gastroenterologist? And I'm going to focus on academic gastroenterologists. And this is the hardest for a lot of trainees because you've been running the rat race for so many years and basically kind of following the breadcrumbs that we've been dropping down. But who are you and what do you want to do as a gastroenterologist? We realize not everybody's going to be an academic gastroenterologist, but if you are pursuing academics, there's a variety of different career paths you can take, from researcher, medical educator. A pure clinician within academics is a valuable career track. People build programs, have leadership roles, and mentorship plays a big part of this as well. And then last but not least, there may be some individual political or visa-related concerns that may dictate or influence your options. So there's probably others that I haven't put on this list that may be personal to you or that I may have left off. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means. It's also important to consider when you're looking at academic jobs, there are academic tracks at most major academic institutions in the US. And so it's important to be familiar with these. So some of these I think we all know about, but there are other less known tracks that are pretty universal. So there's a clinical track, which is basically a pure clinician. And these are increasingly common at most major institutions and universities. They don't have necessarily a tenure component to it, but this can be a real valuable track to every academic center. And so it's important to know that those tracks exist. I think what we all think about as being kind of our academic gastroenterologist is the traditional track, which is your classic mix of research, instruction, education. Some institutions will have specific tracks within that, as such as medical educator. or a clinical research track, for example. And so this tends to be a tenure track, but these vary by institutions a lot. So as you're looking at institutions, it's important to become familiar with this. And then, of course, the traditional research track. These are people who are more dedicated, funded, either basic or translational scientists, usually grant funded. And that's kind of your traditional research track. And why I wanted to introduce this is because it matters what you're going to be considering and negotiating and thinking about out of fellowship, out of training, or an early career transition. Time is important. So ability to negotiate protected time out of fellowship is one of the few opportunities in your career path to negotiate for time even without funding. It's very hard, though not impossible, that when you come into a position to get back protected time without any sort of funding. So it's also important to understand how each university and each setting actually structures their time. What does that equate to? Is everybody 1.0? Is everybody 0.8? And how do you go about funding, and what amount buys what amount of time? And that's an important concept to know about as you look at various jobs. But really what's important is from your tracks and what your career plan is, whether it's clinical research and medical education, what have you, that determines what you may want to focus on in terms of negotiation. So a pure clinician doesn't need a degree program support or lab resources. They need things like dedicated nurses, medical assistants, scribes, perhaps an APP, depending on how busy the practice is, and inbox management, which we'll touch on shortly. Whereas researchers, they may be able to negotiate or ask for or think about things like training programs, statistical support, data analytical or bioinformatics support. And then, of course, as a researcher, you're probably thinking about lab resources, lab personnel, postdocs. Medical education similarly has specific degree programs and time that can be supported in those first few critical years out of training. This also translates into what your expectations are. So if you're a researcher and you're expected to generate 10,000 RVUs per year, that's a pretty untenable proposal in terms of a career proposition. So it's important to know what each track has out in terms of expectations, papers or publications, grant funding and timing, as well as syllabi development in the medical education realm. And this also, of course, bleeds into, importantly, compensation. And then what is that timeline? So when you negotiate a job, oftentimes you'll have X number of years to exceed these expectations or meet these expectations. So having that foresight is very helpful. But most people out of training don't know. So it's important to be honest when you engage in these conversations, because things change, things evolve, and it's helpful and creates happy interpersonal relationships and working relationships to have that kind of honesty and transparency if you're not sure, or you may have a, let's try this for X number of years and then we'll see where we stand type conversations. Some IBD specific job considerations given the forum today. So there's more clinical requirements for IBD appointments than the general gastroenterologist. We need to spend more time. So what does your schedule look like? If you're expected to see new patients every 15 minutes, that's going to be really, really hard for an IBD academic position. So do you have autonomy? Do you have flexibility, or what does that template look like? Paperwork is immense in IBD. There's tons of prior authorizations, peer-to-peers, appeals, and it just gets worse every single year. So are there resources within that position or that institution to support that amount of paperwork, and what does that look like? The inbox volume, as I alluded to earlier, outpaces basically every other GI subspecialty except for hepatology. That was just published out of Mayo, Florida. Nursing support needs to be there to recognize that and help with that. And that influences practice expectations in terms of how much time you can be in front of patients versus how much time you need on your computer. And of course, certain institutions have more system resources. Other institutions have different expectations and how quickly you respond to messages, for example. Now we're seeing a rollout with Epic of artificial intelligence, note generation response to inquiry type responses, which I just played with for the first time this week. And it's really, really nice and probably going to be practice changing moving forward. But IBD is now multidisciplinary, especially in an academic setting. And so what does that look like for each institution is really important to understand. What does nurse care coordinator support look like? Do you have a dietitian with an IBD interest? Is there a behavioral health specialist Clinical pharmacist is now a critical component of that multidisciplinary approach. And of course, you need surgeons, and you need surgeons who have IBD interest and IBD experience to really have a successful practice, or at least knowing where these people are and how to access them. Practice management point. So what if you're going into an IBD oriented position, what does that look like? Are you 100% IBD, only seeing IBD, 50% general GI, 50% IBD? How is that tracked? How is that managed? How can you change your panel over time if it's not 100% or whatever you want it to be? If you're coming into a new position, particularly that hasn't had a history of referrals, what is your referral base? Do you have to build it and go out and do grassroots organization to get it? Or is there an existing referral base? I think for most academic centers, there's some referral base, but really if you're going into a new IBD position where they haven't had that before, that may be a little bit of a development in progress. This is just an example of those tracks that I mentioned before, just showing you, and this is an example from NYU. But this is just how things flow in these tracks. So where do you find these academic jobs? I think importantly, most academic jobs are not posted. They're not out there waiting to be filled by people graduating fellowship. Most are really a combination of opportunity, timing, and the right person for that role, that institution, that leadership person. And really who you know can be very important. So I want to point that out early in your education, career, as well as training, and perhaps in your first or beyond first employment. Networking and reputation is really critical. So getting out there, publish, present at meetings, participate in societies and meetings like you're doing today, educational programs. There's a variety of opportunities for training committees across our major GI societies. Social media can be a nice platform when used appropriately and professionally to get your name out there. And then, of course, being at the meetings, just physically showing up can be very helpful and get your name and your face out there. Perhaps most importantly, though, is who your mentor in training, research, education knows, and not being afraid to ask them to link you to people either in person or electronically as you start to think about your employment and having that sort of relationship. Unfortunately, oftentimes we're left with that dreaded cold email to a variety of different programs and people, and I know at least I personally dreaded that. I hated it. I feel like a used car salesman when I'm doing that. But at the end of the day, that's how these jobs are oftentimes found, developed, and really kind of established. How to find posted positions. I've just listed here a number of websites and centers that can be helpful if you want to find posted positions, for example. Recruiters, they can be helpful, particularly if you're pretty flexible in your exact position and location, but you have to know where they're getting their incentive from. They're not doing it for free or for fun necessarily. And then what are these other positions that they're looking at? Social media, Twitter can be a nice resource. And I've just put up some examples here. ACG has a website, and you can see next on the left panel here, it's not only academic, but it's private practice, hospital-based, et cetera. So a nice resource to just peruse and see if you're getting all those available opportunities. Another one from AGA here. And finally, Twitter can be a nice resource following Crohn's Colitis Foundation, IBD Pro handle. They pop up a lot of opportunities here. And I just highlighted, you can even be the next Ray Cross, since I came across this one from Maryland. Sending that dreaded cold email, we all have to do it. If you need resources on how to find people's emails, you can always ask mentors. We tend to be fairly well connected. It tends to be a small field, but you can also look online. PubMed is a great resource. I'm sure other people have other ways to find emails as well. But oftentimes that corresponding author field in PubMed can be very helpful. Keep that first email concise, be direct but informative. What you want to include in that cold email, at least this is how I think about cold emails: who you are, where you are now. If you have a why am I emailing you and why am I trying to get a job at your institution, include that little line or memo. If you have a value proposal that nobody should be passing up, really include that as kind of your hook in that cold email. For example, if you have funding for the next 5 years and it's transferable, include that in the email. And then, of course, you want to propose a meeting or a phone call and a follow-up date. Avoid really long emails. Avoid over-explaining who you are. Attach your CV. They'll reference it and read it if they have an opportunity and are interested. Avoid demands such as, I need a position with at least 50% protected time. We're all professionals here. I'm a big believer in cutting out the fluff and the hot air that a lot of emails include, such as, oh, I'm very interested in your prestigious university, or how's your family doing type stuff. Yeah, if we know each other, that's great. But if it's a cold email, you don't necessarily have to include it. It can be straight into the point. If you have detailed career goals outlined, you can save those for later, generally, unless you have a very specific position you're looking for. Follow up, generally 2 to 4 weeks. We're all very busy. Leadership positions are even more busy. So don't be depressed or lose hope if there's no immediate response. Sometimes follow-up is necessary. Every email, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten emails from various people and they've had the wrong institution or had misspellings in the names of either me or other providers. So it's important to read everything. I included a cold email sample here just for sake of brevity. I won't go over it today, but this can be referenced: the why you, the why me, the value proposal if there is one, and then following up. Timeline is important. Starting to think about jobs early in the year. It generally takes about a year to find, peruse the jobs, negotiate the contracts, and then get boots on the ground, so to speak. So I put together this timeline, really laying out kind of the major GI or IBD oriented meetings as they fall in the schedule and calendar year, and when to start thinking about various iterations of the interview process. So outreach generally starts the summer before, and then you can see kind of flows through the fall and into the winter to really be thinking about finalizing that contract. Changing jobs happens. Most people will change from their first job out of practice. Oftentimes it happens within 3 years. There's a variety of indications and reasons people may do that, whether it's career growth, change opportunity, leadership positions, personal, and I can't emphasize this enough, personal stuff matters, and personal stuff should be important in our professional lives. And so really focusing on that as potential reasons that people leave. And of course, burnout is a big, big factor these days that drives people to leave positions, whether we want it to or not. Different destinations out of academics, so you can stay in academics, go to private or pseudo-private industry or other roles here. But really, I've learned a lot of lessons having changed positions either out of training or early in my career. It's really important to consider the timing of change and how that may impact what you're hoping to do in your career or your personal life. There's a cost to changing jobs, not only financial and moving, but also there's reputational costs or considerations. You lose some relationships while you develop new ones at other institutions. And then there's a momentum. So especially if you're an academic IBD, there's a lost momentum. I estimate it at about a year of lost time. And then you always have to think about the grass may not always be greener. There's a great saying out there, it's really greener where you water it. So trying to exhaust all opportunities where you are to make yourself happy. It's always easier to stay where you are than leave. And most people want you to stay. So again, conclusion, make a list of priorities. A map can be very helpful just to circle regions and universities. Knowing what you want to do and having an idea to start those conversations can be helpful. But again, it's not contractual when you're starting to have these conversations. It can change. Most jobs require outreach, whether that's through the mentor, through you, cold emails. Don't be afraid to ask your mentor. Start early and follow up and be honest with yourself about and potential employers. It makes everybody happy. And career changes are common. They happen. We all know it happens, and there's a variety of different reasons. And it can be beneficial. It can make you happier and more successful if done right.